Welcome back to Inside the Vatican with America Media. I'm your host, Colleen Dulle. Jerry is out again this week, so joining me this week as guest host is Junno Arocho Esteves, the international correspondent for OSV News. Junno is an American journalist who covered the Vatican from Rome for 12 years, 7 of those as Vatican correspondent for Catholic News Service. And Junno now writes on the international church from his home in Malmö, Sweden. Welcome to Inside the Vatican, Junno.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
In order to understand how we work together, I wonder if you might explain to our listeners briefly what OSV is and how wire services work with magazines.
Sure. I think the best way to think of a news wire service is kind of a wholesaler of the news industry. If you look at bylines from newspapers like the New York Times or the Washington Post, you often see something from the Associated Press or Reuters. In the case of Catholic journalism, most local diocesan newspapers or websites produce their own local stories, but they can't have reporters everywhere. That's where we come in. We're sort of the boots on the ground covering both national and international news, and those stories are then sold to Catholic publications so they can share them with their readers.
Right, similar to what you did at Catholic News Service and what I did back in the day as an intern for Catholic News Service.
Exactly.
So this week, Junno, we'll be digging into 2 stories that we mentioned in the headlines last week and that you actually reported deeply on. One is the Vatican's invitation to join President Trump's Board of Peace. This is a group that's set to assist with the reconstruction of Gaza. And the other is Pope Leo's critical address to the Neocatechumenal Way. But before we dig into those, I wanted to start with something lighter, which is just, how has covering the Vatican changed for you since Pope Leo's election?
I would have to say it's changed quite a bit. I'm in my experience looking back on my time in Rome, I actually started covering the Vatican during Pope Benedict's final year. And I distinctly remember the 2012 Synod on the new evangelization. The press office was pretty empty at that time. It was quieter, more predictable. And the Vatican site would update with the speeches delivered at the Synod Hall. And then the election of Pope Francis changed everything. You suddenly had a pontiff who was an outsider. He didn't stick to the traditional Vatican modus operandi of releasing carefully curated statements. He did the unexpected. He said the unexpected. And he engaged he engaged with us, the press, in ways that kind of shocked the system. I remember the first synod I covered under Francis was the Synod on the Family. And when Pope Francis gave the bishops essentially carte blanche to speak openly, that was a challenge because unlike previous synods where you had all the speeches online, just getting the text of the speeches was a job on its own.
Right. If people are speaking off the cuff, they're not preparing a written copy to be distributed nicely to the press in an orderly fashion.
Exactly.
How about under Leo?
So now with Pope Leo, I think the common theme that comes up about Pope Leo's pontificate is that he's the best of both worlds. So in this particular case, like on one hand, he brings a more careful approach to global events and doctrine. He's open, but very measured in his proclamations. But on the other hand, he's maintained this openness with the press that Francis normalized, essentially. Like we've seen this in the constant comments, the impromptu press scrums that are held outside of Castel Gandolfo. He approaches them, he speaks openly. And so I think the vibe right now is kind of like a cautious openness. But I think the real test is coming this year is to see as he starts settling in, he's naming his own people and key posts, like especially as the head of the Dicastery for Communication. So that'll tell us a lot about how he intends to manage the message going forward.
Yeah, and we'll circle back to kind of what's coming up for Pope Leo this year at the end of the show when we get into some headlines. Let's talk now about this Board of Peace story. So, as I mentioned briefly on last week's show, the Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, commented to reporters on the sidelines of an event in Rome last week that the Vatican and Pope Leo are considering an invitation to join President Trump's Board of Peace. This is an international group that's chaired by Donald Trump that would aid with the reconstruction of Gaza. The board also received UN approval to deploy a temporary peacekeeping force. It was officially announced on January 22nd, and 20 of the 61 states that were invited have accepted the invitation to join the board. Those include Argentina, Hungary, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the UAE. More have said they intend to join. Several European countries, though, have denied invitations, and those include France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, Spain, and where you are, Sweden. So, walk me through what we know about how the Vatican is thinking about this invitation, Juno.
So, as Cardinal Parolin said, they're looking into it in depth. But based on what he said, I think the Holy See is looking at three main hurdles: the money, the mission, and the massive skepticism coming from their European neighbors.
Got it. Let's start with the money.
Yeah. Well, Cardinal Parolin was pretty clear that the Vatican can cough up the $1 billion entry fee for a permanent seat. And while the 3-year invitation to the board is free, I think the Vatican will be looking at the fine print. Because I was looking at the charter for the Board of Peace, and it says that member states shall support and assist the Board of Peace operations.
And that maybe implies financially too.
So, yeah, let's say if the Board of Peace deploys a peacekeeping mission, there's often an expectation that members would provide support financially for those type of missions. So when you look at some of the members of this Board of Peace, compared to Saudi Arabia, the Holy See operates on a shoestring budget. I think the Vatican is likely concerned that a free seat still comes with financial obligations that they just can't meet.
Yeah, Parolin said to the reporters last week that the Vatican would not be able to participate financially. So, I mean, obviously, like you said, referring to the 1 billion, but even if there are just kind of incidental fees or things that they might be expected to contribute to, they really don't have a lot of leeway to do so.
No, they don't. And I think what might possibly be an appeal to joining the Board of Peace, if they're considering it, would be that the Vatican would have a seat at the table and possibly be able to have some influence in the humanitarian aid going into Gaza.
Right. This is the Vatican's real strength. We talk often about how, the Pope is making appeals for peace. He has a whole army of diplomats who are working for peace all of the time. And yet, the places where the Vatican tends to make the most progress with dialogue in between warring parties, for example, or just countries that have tensions between them, is on the humanitarian front. We think back to returning the miners from Ukraine who were then taken to Russia, reuniting them with their families back in Ukraine. That was something the Vatican was really involved in. So, I think they'll be wondering, I think Cardinal Parolin, in his discernment around this, will be wondering, will the Vatican be able to make a difference in humanitarian aid to Gazans by sitting on this board? And that feels like an open question to me.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I think the hesitation from the European allies factors into that. Because as you mentioned before, there's a couple of key European powers that rejected joining the board. France, Belgium, and Italy, which is an important one given the Vatican City state is within Italy.
Right.
And their concern, the concerns that they've expressed, is that it essentially bypasses the United Nations. That's their biggest concern, and they see it as a parallel structure that weakens international law.
Right. This is something that I think critics have raised concern that it would give Donald Trump veto power rather than veto power for any action being in the hands of the UN or the UN Security Council.
Yeah. And I think another major concern that some have expressed is the fact that this sort of Board of Peace that came about due to the war in Gaza, and some have expressed concern that there's no mention of Gaza in the charter. That's something that Cardinal Parolin will be looking at. As a seasoned diplomat, he would share those concerns.
Yeah, especially because, the Vatican has diplomatic relations with the state of Palestine and recognizes it as a state. So I think, this would involve, from the Vatican's viewpoint, a possible territorial issue too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of their major concerns that they probably would share with their allies is that the Vatican is one of the world's staunchest defenders of the United Nations and multilateralism. Last week, when Cardinal Parolin spoke about it, he had mentioned a lecture that he had given earlier in the day to the Pontifical Ecclesiastical Academy.
This is the Vatican school that trains diplomats.
Exactly. And in that lecture that he gave, he warned about a spirit of multilateralism that characterized the post-war years was being lost.
Echoing, I guess, what Pope Leo said in his address to diplomats in early January.
Exactly. So that concern that the European allies have about this Board of Peace kind of taking over what the UN should be doing is a big concern. And I think that the Vatican doesn't want to be seen as validating a rival system that undermines the UN.
That's really interesting, and that makes a lot of sense. Do we know if Cardinal Parolin is in dialogue with other nations about joining the Board of Peace? I remember when he first spoke to journalists about this, it was before Italy had rejected the invitation, but Parolin mentioned, I think Italy is considering this. And so it made me think, that he is looking to other nations, maybe especially other European nations, to figure out what to do.
Yeah, I would imagine this comes up a lot in conversation, but I'm not sure what direction they'll take. I mean, we just recently he was in Denmark, and obviously with Denmark comes the whole Greenland debacle.
Right, because Greenland is actually owned by Denmark. The people of Greenland are Danish citizens.
Yeah. So there was no statement either from the Vatican or the Danish government about what was discussed. He was there for the 1,200th anniversary of the beginning of St. Ansgar's mission in bringing Christianity to Scandinavia. And on this final day, he met with King Frederick X and the foreign minister, Lars Rasmussen. Now, neither the Vatican nor the government released any statement on what was discussed. But the foreign minister did put out an Instagram reel with a picture of him and Cardinal Parolin, and all it said was that he and the Cardinal had discussed a number of the world's current challenges. So it's a safe bet that Greenland and perhaps even the Board of Peace was discussed. And I mean, I think the Holy See is very much aware that the possibility of joining a U.S.-led board rejected by European countries may create a diplomatic wedge. So if, Parolin would probably be trying to calculate if the humanitarian benefit for Gaza is worth the risk of alienating the Vatican's traditional European allies with this board.
Right. I think that sums up the Vatican's calculus on this, the balance that they're considering very well. If our readers, our listeners want to read more from you on this, I will link to your story from OSV in the show notes, Junno. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk about how the Vatican's treatment of lay movements has shifted over time and take a look at Pope Leo's critical talk to the Neocatechumenal Way. Stay with us. Welcome back. On January 19th, Pope Leo gave a notably critical address to a group of 1,000 international members of the Neocatechumenal Way, which is a lay movement. So in this second part of our show, we're going to dig into the context for that address, Pope Leo's past experience with the group, and also how the Vatican has been working to reform lay movements, particularly in the last 5 years. Junno, I know that lay movements are not super common to people in the U.S. They're much more popular, for example, in Latin America. So to start us off, can you just explain what is the Neocatechumenal Way?
Okay, so before we dive in, I think it's important to offer a bit of a disclaimer. I was actually a member of the Neocatechumenal Way for over 20 years. So I think it offers a unique perspective because I've seen the good that it can do. And I'm also very familiar with the internal culture that critics often point to. So especially what Pope Leo points to. So I think it puts me in a unique position to understand both the praise and concerns.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that. So tell me, what is this movement?
So the Neocatechumenal Way is essentially what they call themselves a post-baptismal catechumenate, where one relives the various stages that leads to baptism. Which has often led sometimes to confusion that some people think that they redo a baptism, which they don't.
It's more like if you were baptized as a baby, for example, now you're going through kind of the formation that might lead an adult convert to baptism.
Exactly. Okay. It's kind of a post-RCIA.
Cool.
So it started in the shanty towns of Madrid in the 1960s. And it was founded by Kiko Arguello, who at the time, during that time, he was a an award-winning painter. He came from a wealthy family, and he left everything and decided to live among the poor. And he lived in these shanty towns where all those who were marginalized, gypsies, people with criminal histories, homosexuals, those who weren't accepted by society, they lived in these shanty towns. And he said he didn't go there to preach or to moralize. He just came there to be a presence of Christ. And it was in that time that Carmen Hernandez, a lay missionary, also joined him in living out this presence of Christ among the poor. And all this happened within the context of the Second Vatican Council that was going on.
Yeah, right. So this renewed sense of kind of the missionary role of lay people, our responsibility to spread the gospel, as well as, not just the priests or the bishops.
Exactly. So it was during that time that the Archbishop of Madrid at the time, Archbishop Casimiro Murcia, he went to the shanty towns, saw what was going, and he felt that this was kind of what was discussed in the Second Vatican Council in action. So it moved from the shanty towns to the parishes through the Archbishop of Madrid. But it really didn't take off until St. John Paul II. He released a letter, and in that letter, St. John Paul II said that he recognized the Neocatechumenal Way as an itinerary of Catholic formation valid for society and for the present time.
So, what does that mean practically?
So for the Neocatechumenal Way, this was a validation of their efforts, that they kind of balk at the definition of or it being defined as a movement or a lay association. Oh. So that's why often when they would go to start new catechesis where communities are born, they would show this letter from St. John Paul II. So the Neocatechumenal Way was among many ecclesial realities that at the time that gained prominence under John Paul II. And now the latest figures from the Neocatechumenal Way is that they're spread out across 139 countries with 2,300 communities.
Got it. So let's talk about what Pope Leo had to say to them. And I think maybe this will kind of open the door for us to then talk about some of the criticism of the movement, since some of this criticism came directly from the Pope. I know he couched his criticism in praise for the group's mission, right? That this formation program, this way of recatechizing people, is itself a good thing. But then he specifically called out the need for them to be vigilant, to be, have a good critical capacity towards what they're doing, to be more inclusive, to be more united with the local church. So tell me about what Leo said to them.
Yeah. So, if you look at the headlines, it almost looks like your standard "thank you for your service" message. But, once you start to read the text closely, there are 4 specific warnings that Pope Leo gives them. The first one is internal vigilance, that their spiritual fruit doesn't exempt them from the normal risks and pitfalls, which can honestly come from, many movements can feel that they're a cut above the rest, so to speak. There's a kind of an exceptionalism that they're kind of beyond the normal scandals. And so he's telling them to be on guard. The next point that he makes is about inclusivity. He told them point blank not to feel better than others or to exclude other Catholics, which directly, addresses a common accusation against the way that things are a little bit, closed around themselves. They have their own mass on Saturday evenings.
They have a unique liturgical style, right?
Yeah, they do. And that was also, that was the subject of a bit of back and forth with the Vatican during Pope Benedict's pontificate, where he kind of had to rein in certain liturgical practices that they did. But with the liturgy that they celebrate, where, for example, in the church, you have the altar in the front, the pews all the way in the back. And if you noticed in the liturgy of the Neocatechumenal Way, the chairs are around the altar and kind of forms almost a semi-closed space. And it has this communal effect that you are an active participant in the liturgy and not just a spectator. That's
interesting. I mean, certain churches are laid out like that, right? So it's not inherently a problem, but it seems like there's also something the Pope is getting at here about an attitude of closure.
Exactly. That even in that, which is, they have valid reasons for how they celebrate, but it could be an occasion to exclude somebody because it's like, oh, you have to do the catechesis to understand this, or you have to do a period of formation and joining the community to understand what this really means.
Oh, I see. And Leo actually, I mean, he takes the next step also of talking about unity with the local church and the importance of that.
Exactly. I think that's another aspect that's often criticized about the way is that, I mean, and the thing is, publicly, or at least to its members, in my experience, the way has often spoken about this being a preparation to join the larger church.
So you kind of graduate from it?
Sort of. I think that's the best way you could say it, because there's different steps that they go through in reliving their baptism, and they slowly embrace the teachings of the church. They slowly embrace the life of the church. And so you essentially get to a point where you can become a part of the larger church with an adult Christian outlook on things.
Got it. So the Pope tells this group, he says, to never separate from, quote, the rest of the ecclesial body. And then he warns them against coercion and rigidity and moralism. Coercion is a really strong word. I think that's what originally raised my eyebrows when I was reading this speech. So, is this an issue in the way? I mean, what do we know about this? And I'm asking less from your personal experience and more of, kind of what's been reported about the way.
Yeah, I think those three words, and particularly that one, coercion, was probably the strongest point he's ever made. And it's actually the strongest word that I've ever heard a pontiff say in meeting the way. I mean, even Pope Francis in 2014, his words didn't go that far.
Right. He talked about you shouldn't force anyone to do anything.
Yeah. And I think the most interesting thing was that the Pope used such specific language. And if you look at his history as a bishop, you start to understand why.
Yeah, so let's dig into that. I mean, we're not going to go into the full history here, all the details, but I'm interested in his own experience with the group back in Peru, because it seems like that's probably what he's drawing on in this speech. Now, my understanding of the situation is that he was made the apostolic administrator of a diocese that had a bishop who was a member of the Neocatechumenal Way, but Leo had nothing to do with the bishop's resignation. This is way before Leo was working in the dicastery for bishops or running it. But because he came in after this bishop as administrator, he was familiar with the results of how that bishop had run the diocese. Can you give a rundown of the situation for our listeners?
Yeah, I'll try to go with the Cliff Notes version of this because it's such a long story. But essentially, this bishop, his name is Bishop José Luis del Palacio, was named bishop of the Diocese of Callao in Peru in 2012. And before he was even in the priesthood, he was involved in the Neocatechumenal Way.
Is the way popular in Peru at this time?
Very popular. But this bishop, his tenure was pretty turbulent. Critics accused him of turning the diocese into a sort of fiefdom for the Neocatechumenal Way. There was quite a few incidents that had happened outside of the fact that in 2015, there was a change.org petition against this bishop. They also point to, his affiliation with certain corrupt judges that were involved in some scandal there that I won't get into. Coupled with the fact that he was accused of making a lot of trips to Europe seeking donations, not for the diocese, but for initiatives or projects of the Neocatechumenal Way in his diocese. You put that all together and it makes a recipe for a lot of dissent.
Well, and it looks like, I mean, looking back at that change.org petition, that there were also a lot of cases of verbal abuse by this bishop towards the community, towards women and families, towards people who worked for the church.
Yes, those allegations have been made. So in April 2020, the Vatican accepted the resignation of Bishop del Palacio. From the message that he gave, it was clear that he was asked to resign. So I think at a certain point, many of the priests had complained directly to the Vatican. And, complaints arrive all the time, but usually the Vatican doesn't take action until it's seen some some credible information, but nothing is known as far as what was credible or not. So with all that, enter Bishop Robert Prevost.
Well, let me ask one question before we get into Prevost. So I think maybe in the back of a listener's mind as they hear this will be the question of, whether this was just this Bishop Del Palacios who was acting this way, or, to what extent that kind of behavior can then be read as symptomatic of the way as a whole. To what degree is this just an individual case?
So the thing is that there are some similarities between his case and what happened with Bishop Apurun in Guam. Bishop Apurun's case obviously is a lot different. There were accusations of abuse involved, of sexual...
And this is another Neocatechumenal Way bishop?
Yes.
Okay, so now let's get into Pope Leo's involvement. He's appointed the apostolic administrator after Bishop Del Palacios resigns. What kind of situation does he walk into, and maybe what's his mandate going into this? Was he sent in as like a cleanup guy?
Well, his mandate was to oversee the diocese transition and address the internal divisions and administrative issues left by the previous bishop. He spent months untangling the division and healing the wounds of a local church that felt colonized by the Neocatechumenal Way. So when you hear Pope Leo today warning against rigidity, coercion, or separating from the ecclesial body, I don't think he's speaking theoretically. He's most likely speaking from experience.
I'm hearing echoes of this in how Bishop Prevost dealt with some of the divisions in the Diocese of Chiclayo that he took over as bishop, where he was the first bishop that the diocese had ever had who was not a member of Opus Dei. Opus Dei also kind of is in an interesting place with regard to how you classify it as an ecclesial movement. So it's not exactly a lay movement, just like the Neocatechumenal Way is not exactly a lay movement. But, he also had to go in there and try to heal some of these divisions. So that brings me to this larger contextual question. I remember back in 2021, the Vatican imposed term limits on the leaders of lay movements. And it seemed like this was because there were a lot of concerns that had been raised over the years around cults of personality, around particularly charismatic founders. I don't know if Kiko is considered a particularly charismatic founder or not, but I think about that. I think about kind of the recent repression of the lay movement, the Sodalicium Christianae Vitae, which we know that Cardinal Prevost at the time was involved in advising Pope Francis on. He advocated for victims of the Sodalicio. That is a traditional lay movement. So what picture does this paint altogether for you as a Vatican watcher of how the Vatican's approach to these types of groups might be changing and how Pope Leo might continue that or change it?
So I think it's been a long road for the church, particularly with what you mentioned on term limits for lay leaders. And then we saw, I believe it was in May 2018, when the Vatican, recognizing the potential threat for abuses, whether it's sexual abuse, abuse of power, and conscience, within the movements, they had requested that they submit draft abuse guidelines.
Right. Which was the first time something like that had happened.
And then a year later, Cardinal Farrell had said at the meeting that too many of the groups did not respond or submitted inadequate protocols.
Cardinal Farrell, for our listeners, is the prefect of the Vatican's dicastery for laity, family, and life. So that would be what governs all of these lay movements. And
so during these meetings that Farrell was having with the representatives of lay movements, I think one of the most notable things was there was the testimonies of 3 anonymous survivors who were members of lay associations or movements, and their stories highlighted the suffering that survivors have gone through within lay movements, including pressure to not speak about their abuse. Now we fast forward until most recently with the suppression of Sodalicium. I wrote a monthly commentary for the Swedish Catholic magazine about this and what this means for lay movements. And I think it's a wake-up call. If you look back, there's hardly any oversight. And the Vatican has only recently attempted to rein things in, especially in the wake of some pretty horrible scandals, like the Legionaries of Christ and the lay arm, Regnum Christi, the L'Arche communities in France, the Focolare.
Yeah, I was thinking about the Jean Vanier scandal with L'Arche.
So the Vatican held this meeting in 2018 to kind of submit abuse guidelines, wanting lay movements to submit abuse guidelines. I think the most recent abuse cases within lay movements that have been revealed within the Catholic Church has yet to scratch the surface. You notice that there's three common themes that come up when it comes to these scandals within lay movements. And one, as you mentioned earlier, the cult of personality. And so Kiko Arguello doesn't like the attention, but it doesn't matter really what he thinks about it. It's what's happening. I've seen him in events walking, and he has a throng of people chasing him down.
Yeah, I remember around the time of the conclave, we were talking about Cardinal Zuppi as a possible pope, and there was immediately concern that were he elected, a lot of people said you would get Pope Andrea Riccardi, referring to the long-serving leader of the Sant'Egidio community, which Cardinal Zuppi is a part of. So this is a thing like across ecclesial movements, that you have kind of these leaders who become sort of larger than life and who stay in power a very long time.
Yeah, and I think there needs to be a practical look at whether the person remains as leader because they are an effective leader who follows the church's teaching, or is this leader being viewed by members of that specific movement as the sole interpreter of God's will, and questioning them is equated to questioning God?
Oh, sure. Okay, my last question for you. We have a pope now who has personal experience with some of the aftermath, with some of the victims of these movements. What do you think that's going to change, if anything? I'm asking you to look in your crystal ball a little bit here. What does it mean to have a pope who has this kind of experience?
I think Pope Leo's address, firmly stated that. And we've seen it in past addresses by Pope Francis and even Pope Benedict, to respect the freedom of individuals' conscience. Yeah,
and I think that, this doesn't necessarily mean that the Vatican is heading down a path of repressing further groups, right? The case of Sodalizio is an exception here, I would say. These are groups that do great good in the world, great good in the church. I mentioned Sant'Egidio earlier, which, we raised the concern about Andrea Riccardi being a long-serving head. At the same time, the group has ended wars, right? So, I think that the question for the Vatican is, how do we prevent the abuses? How do we get things under control, but without stifling the genuine good that many of these groups are able to do for people in their individual Christian lives and also for the church as a whole? Junno, if our listeners want to learn more about this talk by the Pope, we will link to your story in OSV News at the link in our show notes. Now, before I let you go, I wonder if you'll join me for two quick news headlines. First off, you recently wrote a story about the Pope's upcoming trips for 2026. What's on the agenda?
So we are looking at a couple of interesting visits. First is Madrid, Barcelona, and the Canary Islands.
When's that?
So I think I believe the Spanish bishops that were in Rome had indicated June 2026.
Okay, so that's possibly this summer. What else do we got?
Yeah, so then there's Algeria and Angola. So with Angola, he'll be visiting a stronghold of steady Catholic growth in the global South, and Algeria is something that really is close to the Pope's heart, particularly because of his Augustinian spirituality.
Yeah, this was the home. Well, it was where Augustine of Hippo was a bishop. And also, as I've never tired of noting on this show, Pope Leo's constant refrain about a disarmed and disarming peace actually comes from Chrétien de Chergé, who was one of the martyrs of the Tiberine who was killed in Algeria.
Mm-hmm. And so that will be a very important and personal trip, not just because of his Augustinian spirituality, but also as a moment that he's said himself that it's a moment for interreligious dialogue and to foster dialogue between Christians and Muslims.
Are there any other trips on the agenda?
Right now, there's nothing confirmed, but it has been said that the bishops that the Cardinal of Mexico City has extended an invitation for the Pope to visit. The Cardinal said that Pope Leo was hoping to visit, that he was positive about a visit, and he had interest in going because he wanted to entrust his pontificate to the Virgin Mary.
And in that category of, things that he has mentioned wanting to do, that he's been invited to do so far, but that we don't have an agenda for, is a possible trip to South America to visit Peru and Argentina, possibly Uruguay as well, I believe. And we know that his brother John has said publicly that the Pope will come celebrate his funeral. So way down the line, hopefully, a possible trip to the United States.
Yeah.
All right, secondly, Pope Leo issued his message for World Communications Day, and this year's message focused primarily on artificial intelligence. It included a pretty firm call for AI and media literacy education. Now, Junno, we've heard rumors since the beginning of this pontificate, ever since Pope Leo said that he chose the name Leo in honor of Leo XIII and made a parallel between the Industrial Revolution, which was happening under Leo XIII, with the AI revolution that's happening during his pontificate, that we might eventually get a big document from Pope Leo on AI. What do we know about whether or not that might happen or when?
So from the Vatican, we know nothing. All we can go by is by Italian media reports that have reported on this possible encyclical, that the rumor is that it would come out in early 2026. And there's even a rumored title for this encyclical, Magnifica Humanitas, Magnificent Humanity. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. Right now we're in the zone of speculation.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll keep our eyes out for anything that's coming about that's confirmed. In the meantime, to land us in the land of facts, if you want to read a story about the history of the Vatican's involvement in AI, which goes back quite a long time, well before a lot of us were ever aware of this term, artificial intelligence, I have a story outlining that I'll link to in the show notes, and I'll also link to a report on Pope Leo's message for World Communications Day, the one calling for greater media literacy. Junno, thank you so much for hopping onto the show this week. I appreciate you sharing all of your expertise on these lay movements, and I hope that we can talk to you again soon. Inside the Vatican is a production of America Media. This week's episode was produced and audio engineered by Kevin Christopher Robles. To keep up with the latest news out of the Vatican, visit americamagazine.org and subscribe at americamagazine.org/subscribe. For America Media with Junno Arocho Esteves, I'm Colleen Dulle. We'll see you next week.